frequencies will only be available, of course, after the switch off. Due to the excellent propagation characteristics in this band, extended coverage can be achieved by broadband service providers. As a result, there will be a significant growth in broadband coverage and capacity in Brazil. We are expecting this. This, of course, is licensed use of UHF spectrum. But additionally, that there is, of course, this we are discussing the use of a portion of the UHF frequency band in order to become available this experimenting. Additionally, Anatel has recently, which is very important for the development of this market in Brazil, has recently deployed a new spectrum management system and database that contains all relevant information for planning, licensing, and monitoring spectrum use in Brazil by telecom operators and broadcasters. The system is fully operational and provides Anatel geo-referenced information on existing infrastructure and spectrum use. Of course, this will give a good level of protection too for the primary use, and will provide a level of information that is very important to develop white spaces operation here in Brazil. Finally, Anatel is currently in the process of updating the existing regulation on radio frequency spectrum use. It's resolution of Anatel. A public consultation was conducted in 2014, and the proposed new regulation is under review by the technical areas at Anatel. A decision by the board of Anatel is expected for early 2016. All these elements that I will show some for you are aimed to achieve a better use of spectrum. And of course, we are expecting that civil society and operators can bring us some other inputs. In radio frequency bands that have been allocated to a primary use, that there will be the possibility of allocating the same band with some protection for the use of for the secondary use. This will be the case when the primary use has not initiated services within a predetermined time period. A user who has been granted a radio frequency band for the provision of one service is entitled to request to provide any other services to which that band has been allocated. Clarifications on the distinction between cases in which there is a requirement for previous request from interested parties before a frequency band is granted to give user, and cases in which there is no such requirements. Provisions for merchant market commercial agreements of spectrum use between telecommunication service providers. Example includes run sharing and roaming based sharing. Of course, all of it's under public consultation, and we are happy to have some more inputs to have a better use of spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Zerboni. And now we have another regulator. We have a move from the FCC to be presented for us.
Good day. My name is Robert Nelson. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. However, Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you on the possibilities brought forth by the digital dividend. I first want to indicate through our usual disclaimer that my comments don't necessarily represent the views of the Commission, but I do want to give you an idea of the direction the Commission may be going in these areas. First, I would like to provide some insight into how the FCC has been progressing in regard to the digital dividend. This chart shows all of the TV channels that existed in the United States as late as June 2009. The UHF spectrum in the US was channels 14 through 69, or 470 to 806 megahertz. In 2009, it had analog TV as well as transitional ETV stations. You will note that I divided the spectrum into 3 rows. The top row are channels 14 through 29, which are likely at this time to maintain TV broadcast. The bottom row are channels that after the original transition have become our 700 megahertz wireless band with commercial and public safety use. The middle row is our next step in consolidation involving our incentive auction. Depending on the outcome of the auction, these channels may be used for either wireless or broadcast. Please note that channel 37 is reserved for radio astronomy and medical devices in the United States. I will now go into detail on 700 megahertz in the incentive auction. First, the original DTV transition freed up 108 megahertz of spectrum. Congress gave us direction on its intent for allocation in the band, and a portion of the spectrum was designated for public safety use. In the commercial blocks, 74 megahertz was assigned through our auction authority. This brought in $19 billion US. Since that time, those commercial carriers have used this spectrum in their development of LTE, and is one of the reasons we have such widespread provision of LTE in the United States today. The public safety spectrum included a portion that was designated for a broadband nationwide network, which we call FirstNet. In addition, we authorized the use of white spaces devices on those TV channels that would not cause interference to local broadcasters. This chart should provide you with an idea of the companies who are currently licensed and using the 700 megahertz spectrum. Once the broadcasters had cleared this spectrum as a result of the transition, it was pretty much a greenfield for the wireless entities to build out on. This allowed for rapid deployment of 4G services by those carriers. The band plan we used is the North American band plan, and 3GPP has designations for those bands. Bands 12, 13, 14, and 17 for those of you familiar with band designations. The FirstNet public safety band is also a 3GPP designated band, band 14. I would point out that we also have in this band narrow band public safety channels which are utilized by local first responders. The FirstNet broadband public safety channel comprises about 2/3 of the designated spectrum for public safety. After completion of the 700 megahertz transition, it became clear that more spectrum was necessary for wireless broadband. The Commission issued a national broadband plan, which you can find at www.broadband.gov, calling for an additional 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next 10 years. Congress also authorized the Commission in 2012 Spectrum Act to hold incentive auctions, including for the TV broadcast bands. An incentive auction offers the broadcaster the opportunity to turn in their license or move to VHF for compensation. I would point out that participation in the auction is voluntary. If a broadcaster does not wish to participate, it does not have to, and it is up to the FCC to find a place for that station when we, and I will use a term that we described the next step, repack the spectrum. As I mentioned, participation is voluntary. The process has two major steps: a backward auction, where the broadcaster offers to either go off the air or move to VHF at a price, and a standard forward auction, where the wireless company purchases the spectrum for wireless use. The total amount offered by the wireless entities must exceed the total current offer price by the broadcasters for the auction to close. The offered value of the spectrum may change depending on the need for the TV station spectrum or the need of the wireless entity. Thus, the market-based means of spectrum repurposing. If we have a surplus of TV stations or not enough money is being offered by the wireless entities, then the broadcasters may be offered a lower price, which they do not have to accept. The band plan may be reduced, and then we continue the process. The process continues until the proceeds exceed the reverse auction payments. Again, we have several goals in the auction, which include preserving broadcast service for the non-participants, making sure that we meet Congress's objectives, and that proceeds exceed reverse auction payments. Also, that we have created a launchpad for new wireless networks. This is a unique opportunity for broadcasters, as it offers them the possibility of some very good return. It also allows us the ability to gain some valuable wireless spectrum. Now, I noted that the resulting spectrum allocation depends on the results of the auction and primarily participation. The band plans here are possible outcomes of the auction if there is very high participation. There could be up to 126 megahertz of spectrum for wireless coming out of the auction. If market forces result in a smaller plan, they are also shown here. I would point out that guard bands will likely be used for such things as unlicensed devices, and we will continue to allow white spaces devices where possible. We also will continue to set aside the former channel 37 for radio astronomy and medical devices. As I speak with you today, we currently have staff at the World Radio Conference in Geneva looking at additional bands for mobile broadband. Our position is flexible utilization of the UHF bands. This means that we believe that if countries wish to maintain their current use of these bands, they should be able to do so. However, if countries wish to advance mobile broadband in these areas, the opportunity should be provided consistent with their domestic priorities. I hope my presentation has provided you with some insight into the direction we are heading here in the United States and provide some fuel for your upcoming discussions. At this time, I would like to put in an advertisement for our International Visitors Program. If you would like to get some information on it, the contact information is provided here. Also, my contact information as well. All the best, and thank you for your time today.
Okay, it's a great video with a lot of information, so we can use in our debate. And later, and now I'll move to Gregory Taylor.
I do have a PowerPoint presentation. If there we go. Thank you very much. This is, I think, a good time to follow the United States when talking about band plan issues, because that's largely what Canada does. And so for today, I want to take a look at a unique initiative in Canada right now that has to do with white space development. And I'm not sure where exactly I'm to point this. Do I point it that way to change the... I'm trying to go forward. There? I'm not sure, but okay, I'm going to keep talking anyway since we're on a... sorry, which did you press? Yeah, that's what I did. It didn't move. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so remote rural broadband is something that has developed in Canada within the last few years. I'm going to be taking a look at why this is necessary, what it is, and basically the success or lack thereof thus far in Canada. Like Brazil, Canada has a history of trying to reach out to the rural areas, and that for Canada, much like Brazil, it's a very large country. There is always, with every new development in technology, there is the struggle of how do we get to the rural areas, and not even as much the small communities, but much more so small areas, small rural areas of Canada. I'm not going to go through all of these different issues or these different moments of the last 10 years, except to say Canada has had about 10 to 12 federal initiatives to try to bring broadband to rural parts of the country. It's gone over 10 years, the most recent being the launched Canada Digital 150, a 25-page document that was about connecting Canadians around the country and exploiting economic opportunities. The key platform of that was connecting rural Canada. So this remains a major issue for Canadians. Canadians living in large centres have access to broadband speeds of about 50 megabits per second and up to 99 megabits per second, but only 25% of Canadians in rural areas can access these speeds. This chart is from our regulator, the Canadian Radio Television Communication Commission. If you take a look up there, the kind of grayish color notes that when you're starting at the slow speeds, rural Canada is almost as strong as urban centers in Canada, and then it drops very quickly as you move up into the higher speeds. The column on the right being rural Canada. As the speeds go up, rural Canada drops off extremely quickly. So this is a problem, not that there is no broadband, but it's the quality of broadband that's available in some of these areas. So Canada came up with a policy called the Remote Rural Broadband Systems, and this had a long gestation period, but the formal announcement came in 2011. It's a fixed wireless station that offers a fixed service and operates in the 512 to 600 megahertz and 614 to 698 megahertz bands. This was after recognizing that Canada was going through the digital television transition. 700 megahertz was not going to be offered because it went to licensed providers. RRBS is what's called a secondary service. It must not cause interference. There is no protection given to these licenses, and licenses are renewed annually. So the licenses are distributed on a first-come, first-served basis. They're using the television white space in rural areas where Canada does not have a strong over-the-air television presence. That is most of Canada. Over-the-air television in Canada is not widely used. It's used by approximately 10% of the population. And when you get into rural parts of Canada, the range in the 600 megahertz set aside for over-the-air television is largely vacant. So this spectrum sits unused in most parts of Canada. So this was a federal government initiative to try and bring some development, some use to this really prime part of the spectrum in Canada. So as far as defining it, what is rural? Well, 100,000 people living within a 50-kilometer radius. This was a big issue when deciding who could benefit from this service. How do you define rural? Small communities in Canada are generally able to get wired service. The rural areas less so. So part of the problem was defining rural. So let's see here. So why is it necessary? Well, Canada lags behind in urban centers and high-speed deployment. Fixed wireless TV space, what is it? Sorry, it's TV white space secondary to broadcasting and licensed annually. Now, to take a look at where it is, this is a map outlining where remote rural broadband systems were existed in Canada in 2014. You can see they're mostly in the west. Also, they are mostly near the northern parts and near areas where there are obviously very small population centers. We're really in the beginning of trying to figure out the next part, which is that a year later, This is a year later, and 40%, this is 2015 now, 40% of the remote rural broadband systems had ceased to operate. So something happened in the early stage of offering this new system where 40% of the providers stopped providing service. And we believe that most of it can be attributed to the fact that right now they're looking to reassess and reassess the 600 megahertz band in Canada, and this is precisely because of what's happening in the United States. As Robert Nelson just said to us, they're reprogramming or resetting the 600 megahertz. Canada is now waiting to see what is happening in the United States, and in doing so, they have frozen the any new licenses for remote rural broadband in Canada, and they cannot modify or grow their systems at all. So right now there's really been a freeze. It has hurt the industry, and 40% of this brand new industry stopped providing service. I'm not going to read through all of these. This is just saying what it is, that they have no protection, that it's repurposed 600 megahertz spectrum, and in the end that Canada has to follow what happens in the US 600 megahertz plan. To say that it's a North American band plan on the 700 megahertz isn't quite true. Canada follows along with that band plan, but not necessarily in other countries. Mexico does not use the same 700 megahertz band plan. So this is it. It is how the system works in Canada. We've spoken to a couple of providers, and one points out that if they change frequencies, it severely impacts small providers. They would have to go to each of their customers. They measure their customers in hundreds, not thousands, not tens of thousands, but hundreds of customers. And they have been quite clear that if we change what the spectrum that they have been given, that it will put them out of business. They need good spectrum in order to do things like get through tree coverage in parts of rural Canada. So two things are slowing the development. The uncertainty of the long-term availability of the spectrum. Annual licenses make for a difficult business model. And two, the spectrum being a Tier 2 license and subject to being overturned by a broadcasting station, basically there is no security. It's hard to operate with such little security in this area. So it's a new initiative that Canada is using in providing for rural areas. It's using white space, but it has only had a mixed success. This is also from a provider who said we are using very basic features and would like to develop it further, but uncertainty of usable spectrum cools development. So we have this example of a new initiative in white space. It has real potential, but it hasn't really been given the opportunity to develop. And I think it's one that provides a template that other countries might find useful as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregory. We move to Mike Jensen.
Thank you. It's Mike Jensen here from the Association for Progressive Communications. We are an association of NGOs from around the world focusing on improving internet access with a developing country perspective. I think the first point I'd like to make is that there is no real one-size-fits-all strategy with regard to developing a national spectrum strategy. I think we can see already from the diversity of the presentations we've had already that we can't really adopt one particular model that has been tried, for example, in North America or Europe, where, for example, most houses either have cable TV or don't use over-the-air broadcasting or have 99% penetration of residential broadband. So in those situations, when we compare that with some developing countries where there's almost no fixed line infrastructure and very little broadcasting, especially outside of the major urban centers, the environment is very different, and we need to be careful about thinking that there is a global strategy with regard to how we move forward in the spectrum area. Particularly in relation to using TV white space, which APC feels has huge potential in developing countries for meeting connectivity needs and providing low-cost community connectivity providers in rural areas with an option that can provide improved competition against some of the existing players. So we've seen some tests already that have been conducted in many urban areas in Africa, even in the most densely used area of the broadcasting spectrum in Africa probably, which is Cape Town, due to its mountainous topography and fairly advanced broadcasting infrastructure. An extensive TV white space test there showed that there was no interference with the broadcasters' services. And then as we move into other parts of Africa, virtually none of the broadcasting spectrum is used in rural areas, except perhaps in some cases for some of the national broadcasters. So it's a bit unfortunate this TV white space technology is got the white space in the name, because in fact it's not just the guard channels that can be used, but in fact most of the broadcast spectrum can be used for broadband services. So then I think the next point that I'd like to make is that APC is particularly concerned about the vested interests in older technologies, in older business systems, and in old ways of doing things with regard to the use of spectrum. So we're seeing, for example, mobile operators using the spectrum issue as a way of maintaining their franchise in provision of services, and generally making efforts to acquire spectrum that could be used more efficiently, and generally also influencing regulators by saying that we don't really need TV white space because mobile broadband is going to provide the only solution that we really need to provide connectivity to the next billion. So we really have to be aware of those kind of influences that regulators in developing countries are under when they are making their new strategies with regard to these emerging technologies, which, as Steve has mentioned, really do have tremendous potential for addressing the issue of better spectrum management. Similarly, we see many regulators still focused on the old way of doing things. We see now, after 4 years of preparation, a whole month being spent in Geneva at the ITU World Radio Conference, where people are haggling over 50 kilohertz of spectrum, where this is clearly not an efficient use of human resources when software can do a much better job of this, and that's where things are going. Similarly, I think we need to anticipate to what extent we really need broadcast channels. Clearly they are needed right now, but when we look at the incredible switchover in North America and Europe and parts of Asia, and even in parts of urbanized Africa where there's good broadband, people are switching over to use of the broadband services for accessing traditional broadcast type service delivery of content. So I think we need to think about how things are going to be going in the future, even though we might not be there just yet. I think I'll pause there so that we have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Veridiana, por favor.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Veridiana Alimonte. I'm from Intervozes, which is a Brazilian civil society organization that it was created in 2003, and since then it has been fighting for media democratization in Brazil, including policies related to internet. Well, we are talking here about how the spectrum has been a public and crucial resource to communications since the radio era, or even prior of this. So regulatory choices and constraints can now be changed, as we've been talking, with information, digitalization, and technologies such as cognitive radios. But, and regarding internet, this communication potential will only be for everyone if we overcome the challenge of unrestricted and universal internet access. At the same time, to effectively serve to empower people and communities, it must be public interest driven with broad social participation. An important part of the persistent digital divide that open rooms for distorted solutions as zero rating and the app Free Basics that is part of the Internet.org project could be overcome with a more democratic spectrum allocation. And we are seeing here a series of experiences, and I think it's important and interesting to have a dialogue about our experiences and challenges. So regarding Brazil, when we see the mobile access statistics that are released, they can make people happy about the situation in Brazil, but it's important to raise some concerns about, because most of these mobile plans are prepaid with low data caps, which gives a lot of limitations to its usage. In rural areas, the situation is worse, and the politics quite insufficient to deal with this with really poor coverage. In Brazil, the spectrum allocation to mobile services has privileged the main companies without adopting a standard to reserve portions of the allocated spectrum for public power use directed to policies implementation, or a larger subdivision in order to make the licenses more accessible to smaller providers. A different vision was recently applied by Anatel, our telecom regulatory body, when approved the notice forbidding the remains of 3 bands, 1.8, 1.9, and 2.5 gigahertz, for the provision of fixed and mobile broadband. In some cases, selling the frequencies by municipality to encourage the entry of smaller providers. However, this initiative raised another issue that we're talking here, and even Maximiliano said, the non-use or underuse of a significant part of these frequencies. Maximiliano said that in 50% of the Brazilian cities, 50% of the spectrum is being used. Only 50% of the spectrum is being used. So we need to advance on the secondary use of radio frequencies, taking into account cognitive radio technologies. In Brazil, we are also discussing a new regulation on restricted radiation, with a proposal to remove the licensing need for the provision of broadband by small providers through restricted radiation radio communications equipments. It's an interesting initiative, but some civil society organizations consider that other bands should be included as well, as the regulation on the use of non-licensed bandwidth should stimulate and even prioritize non-profit initiatives or the direct state provision in the context of public policies. Finally, but not less important, as Adriano Belisario said, the digitalization of information and cognitive radio technologies allows us to move forward in the democratization of the use of the spectrum, also for other services, and not only for internet specifically, which is the unlicensed use, or with light licenses for communitary use in more traditional services of communication, such as radio and television. And when we talk about free spectrum discussions, we talk also about these regulatory constraints that sometimes they really have to, they really are dealing with natural or real limitations, but most of the times these constraints are more directed to create artificial scarcity. And the decisions regarding digital television in Brazil are a huge example about it. So we lost an opportunity to amplify the channels and put a more diversity in our TV services, and the choice wasn't that. So we have now, with technology and with this kind of discussions, the opportunity to meet the real restrictions, to meet regulatory restrictions with real restrictions, and amplify our communication potential, always regarding human rights, plurality, and diversity. That's our main concern. That should be our main concern. That's it.
Thank you, Veridiana. And now we move to Harold Feld.
Thank you. I am with an NGO called Public Knowledge. I have personally been involved in spectrum policy in the public interest for going on 20 years now. Rather than simply echo my agreement with many of the comments that have been made by my colleagues, let me talk briefly about the challenges for civil society in participating in spectrum policy. Because the stakes are so incredibly valuable right now, I would like to point out that one of the problems we often have is people don't notice what's going on. We talk a lot about caring about serving rural. I can tell you that people who think nothing is happening in white spaces in the United States are unaware that through unlicensed spectrum, we are now serving perhaps about 5 million of the most rural inhabitants in the United States. Many of those WISP providers, wireless ISP providers, are supplementing with first-generation fixed TV white spaces equipment, as one expects in first-generation TV white spaces equipment, particularly with a regulatory overhang from the upcoming spectrum auction of broadcast space. The deployment is doing a lot of things. There are issues. People are learning from them. And the next generation, presuming that regulators don't pull the plug on it, will be dramatically improved. And this is just one example in one of the things that we're talking about in terms of license-exempt spectrum. There is enormous possibility here. We are at a stage where the technology is at last catching up to things that we envisioned 10 years ago, 15 years ago as possibilities, and the regulatory sphere, while still very closed, is starting to shift. As I sometimes say, I am the beneficiary of people who worked in this before me who managed to turn hard rock into something close to slowly flowing magma, and I am hoping that we will be able to accelerate that pace of change from maybe slowly flowing magma to something that's flowing like faster flowing magma sometime soon. The issues for civil society are, first of all, and it's important to understand, there's an enormous ramp up of expertise within civil society that has to take place. This is an issue that takes a long time to get into the details, and the details matter. That is often very frustrating to people, particularly to funders who are looking for results. Vincerf pointed out in a panel earlier that it was 10 years from the time they wrote the first paper on the internet to when they first turned on something that was an internet connection, and then another 10 years after that until the worldwide web. We are not usually given the luxury of 20 years to prove ourselves in civil society about the enormous value of license-exempt, unlicensed spectrum in this space. We desperately need representation in the ITU processes, particularly the World Radio Conference and standards bodies, because these are the places where we will achieve harmonization and economies of scale which drive the low cost. Wi-Fi has become so exciting as a means of deployment precisely because there is an international standard. It has been widely adopted. It has driven down costs enormously. WRC is incredibly important in harmonizing the band plans. It is, as others have pointed out right now, dominated by the license carriers and broadcasters, and a civil society presence is sorely needed there to raise issues that are not directly translated into business plans. Similarly, we desperately need to change the mentality of regulators. Changing anybody's idea about anything takes a long time, and most of what we thought we knew about spectrum and spectrum policy turns out to be completely and catastrophically wrong. We don't need to limit the number of people that use the public airwaves in order to prevent interference. We now have software that is much better than that than regulators. We do not need to have auctions to allocate a no longer scarce resource, but the lure of that revenue is incredibly powerful for regulators, for local government, for national governments, and the fact that that assists the wealthiest interests is part of what formulates that dynamic. Only a strong civil society presence, well-versed in both the technical arguments, the economic arguments, and the use cases that are proving successful can outweigh these issues. I do not want to pretend that if we don't get it right in the next few years that we will never have another chance. After all, we're being a chance now with unlicensed spectrum to correct the mistakes of last century, but to get that second chance took 100 years. And I would really like us to not blow it this time around, particularly when in so much of the world there is so much greenfield in spectrum that if we can actually get the policy, which should be the easy part, right, the technology and the economics follow simply from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you. Queria perguntar para a coordenação se tem alguém que pretende falar de fora. Se tem alguém aí pelo sistema, algum tipo de pergunta de fora aí.
There are no remote participations.
No
Thank
remote
you.
participation. Okay. Aqui na sala, is there anyone in the room that wishes to speak? The mics are open. The mics are open. Okay. So we have 1, 2, if you 3. Okay. If you please state your name, your like your area, if you are civil society, private business, or government, and so on and so forth, and please do your comment.
Okay, I'm Giacomo Mazzone from the European Broadcasting Union, representing here the Baltic Broadcasting Union. And your question is very complex, who I belong to, because we have state broadcasters, public service broadcasters that are civil society, and commercial enterprises. So I leave to you the interpretation. What I want to say is that simply I'm here because I'm breaking my participation to the World Radio Conference that has been mentioned many times today, because the conference started last week and will end at the end of the month of November. This conference will change a lot in the regulation, because from now on till 2018 there will be no more a conference of this kind, very probably, to discuss about the use of the spectrum. And there are some important things that are happening there behind closed doors. Even for the delegates, some of the things are happening by negotiation and by interference by governments. As you probably know, all the regions arrive, except one, arrived to the conference saying that there will be no change in the broadcasting spectrum, for instance, and in other kind of spectrum, band C, that is used for satellite communication, for instance. And then, once the conference started, some governments start to call the delegation, or they call the capital, asking to change the position of the delegation. Notably, this is the position of the US, that is lobbying intensively on many other countries, asking them to change the position. What is going on is that there are requests for lowering the spectrum for broadcasting beyond the 600, so going till 400, for not only for the region 1, that North America, but also for the rest of region 1 and all the others. And also there is a request for getting space from the band C that is used for satellite. Why the very day that I left Geneva, where we were discussing, there were all the satellite users, NASA, European Space Agency, that were desperate, because at the moment the telecom operator are asking for using the bandwidth for satellite for research, the satellite for the Rosetta mission, for instance. That bandwidth has been asked to be used for mobile telephone. So there is a problem there, that all the spectrum is going to be auctioned, and all the spectrum is going to be attributed only on purely economic and financial basis. As you know, probably Obama, in the agreement that we made with the Republican majority in the Congress, is one of this point that is very surprising for me to find in the agreement between the President of the US and the main opposition party that ruled the chambers, is that he is obliged to sell, to put on auction most of the part of the spectrum that is used for public use in the US in the next years. Why? I think that there is a deliberate will to transform the spectrum in purely an economic and business-oriented activity, where the public interest, the public goods, the public service has no space at all. So the white space exists if the broadcasting space, if that's, that part of the spectrum is used for broadcasting, but if it's used for mobile, the white space doesn't exist anymore. So I wonder if in the future we will have still to discuss about this kind of things. The main problem is that if we don't change the general attitude that the spectrum is a common good and need to be preserved for the general interest, there will be no more that kind of discussion. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. I was there in the Geneva last week, so I'm aware of the discussions, and you quite summarize very well what we are in Geneva right now. What is funny that I was in there was some booths in the conference center, and EBU has one on booths. There's also a satellite company, satellite association with one booth, and they are both in front of the GSMA booth, and in the GSMA say spectrum for all, and they're claiming to take the piece of the spectrum for broadcast, as you just said. Okay, the next one is okay.
Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Thiago Novaes. I'm a researcher. I've been collaborating now with Instituto NUPEF, but I have also, well, some years dedicated to governments, precisely Minister of Culture and Minister of Communications. I was also part of the Brazilian team that has developed the Brazilian digital TV. So my main question would be basically, I would like to thank the last interveners here, which is to ensure that we have the space for communities and public interest on the spectrum. What do you guys think about, well, the recommendation of United Nations, which is to split the spectrum? In Latin America, it has been, well, being discussed, like we have 1/3 for communities, 1/3 for the state, and 1/3 of the spectrum for market. And in Brazil, so far, the Article 223, it has been ignored. It doesn't work. We don't see it has been discussing anywhere. And as a United Nations recommendation, and as a probably the best way to ensure that communities will have the possibility to keep their communications, what do you guys think about, well, let's fight to reserve a part of the spectrum for as a common good?
Thank you, Thiago. The next one, the next and the last one. Yep, you, please.
Hi. Hello. My name is Lucas. I work at Coding Rights. I'm part of civil society. And we work mainly with surveillance and privacy issues. And I would like to ask if there are considerations and discussions regarding surveillance. As you may know, the UN Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, David Kay, says a lot about the importance of anonymity and cryptography for freedom of expression. Also, the IETF is now having privacy considerations in each document they produce about standards, and I would like to know how this subject is being approached by the spectrum discussions and community.
Thank you. So our time is we are short in time. So what I would like to propose for our table is like to address the issues that were raised during our dialogue, and I would like to summarize some points and bear in mind that I may have some problems in understand some of the points that was raised, but Catherine raised a good point by saying we need to speed up the access to spectrum, and that was some of the points that were raised by the civil society representatives from Adriano, from Veridiana. It was also mentioned the need to open the spectrum, as was suggested by Adriano, and Harold mentioned one thing that is very important, that is unlicensed spectrum. And here in Brazil, I can tell you, Harold, unlicensed spectrum is responsible for at least 4,000 different ISPs providing service across the country. So it's a very interesting way a spectrum is being used, as I mentioned before, to having people accessing the internet. Unlicensed spectrum is very important piece of this discussion. Mike mentioned Stephen mentioned the technology that will bring new stages in the spectrum management. Mike mentioned also the opportunity to use the white space in rural areas, and Gregory also made the example from Canada in rural areas using a new way to approach the spectrum in rural areas. But at the end, when our colleagues and I myself, I'm a regulator, you know. I work for the ministry, I'm an employee for the Brazilian regulator. When we listen to what the regulator they just said to us, they said, we'll do auctions. Okay, I can't have auctions for small operator. We have that in mind, but still we are managing spectrum as the spectrum has been managed for like 40 years. So where's the problem? I will start to talk about that, and our colleagues in the audience, they made some comments. So this would be the drivers for myself for the table, so we could start with you, and then we have a round table here.
Thank you. I think the only point I'd like to make, I'm not very familiar with the United Nations resolution, but I believe the whole of the spectrum is a public good, and I don't think we should be thinking about apportioning
Can you
some
speak
of
louder or there? Podiam colocar mais alto o volume ou? Okay, go.
Sorry, I was saying that I don't think we should be thinking about reserving some of the spectrum as a public good. I think the entire spectrum band is a public good, and we should be looking at better management of it in its entirety, and not just thinking that some of it should be sectioned off for the public and the rest being private. Thank you.
Yes, I have to agree. I think that UN resolution encapsulates everything that is wrong with how we are thinking about spectrum. And in particular, as a practical matter, the approach of segmenting and giving communities small portions generally has been enormously unsuccessful because of the costs. The lack of economies of scale, except in certain places like low power FM or community television, which use the same equipment, and ultimately they are made subordinate to the commercial interests and gradually, eventually reclaimed from the commercial interests. So I think the broader approach is to move away from an idea of scarcity that we need to somehow preserve and shift instead to an idea of abundance. There is a lot of spectrum out there. It should not be constrained, and our focus should be on how to ensure that local communities and individuals are empowered to use these technologies and actually own the means of communication rather than be dependent upon large corporations owning the means of communication.
I also have some difficulty with the one-third, one-third, one-third approach. I think that it really does not divvy up that cleanly, and it's different from place to place. I also would like to say that I think that something that has to change, and this is where academia and civil society can, I think, play a strong role, and that is to change the dialogue about scarcity. Scarcity has become the de facto approach for the last, 100 years, and it's still taken as a given. There's a lot of evidence right now to question the very basis of the spectrum scarcity approach. And until we prove the difficulty of that approach, I think we're still facing an uphill battle. So I think that a lot of emphasis and effort should be made right now on proving that the scarcity argument is a construction. It's not a simple fact of science as it's so often portrayed. Thanks.
I just want to try and tie some comments together here. Starting with the question about the UN resolution, I think one of the key things is understanding that spectrum is a multidimensional resource. So if I'm speaking loudly up here and someone's having a whispered conversation in the back, those are two different kinds of use of spectrum in a way. You know, a radio that whispers versus a radio that's speaking very loudly can coexist in the same space. The radio I'm using in João Pessoa, it doesn't affect the radio that I'm using in Rio de Janeiro. The radio I turn on at night doesn't affect the radio I use in the morning. I mean, there's so many dimensions to spectrum use that can be made much more efficiently that it is ultimately clumsy to try and simply divide it into chunks. The only other point I want to make is about open standards and the importance of open standards, and that it draws a distinction between two very similar uses of technology, the RRBS rural broadband and TV white spaces. And the distinction you can make between those technologies is that TV white spaces technologies are based on standards, on IEEE standards 802.11af, 802.22, which encourages industry associations and builds momentum around manufacturing that creates the same kind of momentum that we've seen develop around Wi-Fi. And I think that's a critical distinction. And just lastly, I just want to emphasize Harold's point that there's a lot to learn here, and we desperately need civil society to get involved in this process, because if we don't, you know, spectrum will be taken away from us.
Yeah, I think just reinforcing that point about the need for civil society, but I think the enormous challenge here is that we have this massive industrial complex, which is the existing system, supported by the regulatory environment, supported by massive corporations, and that's the way it is. So I just don't see how we get to this point of change. That's just a fundamental observation. What do? We've got one direction driving us towards sharing, one locking it down, and they seem to be fundamentally incompatible.
Diana,
Well, just a brief comment about the complementarity principle and Brazilian Constitution and UN resolution. Yes, of course, this is inside a scarcity logic, and well, inside this logic, which is the one that drives all the regulation and spectrum regulation until now, unfortunately, for us who an organization that studies the regulation on communication, there's a law in Argentina that did this divide, one third, was an advance in relation to what we have in Brazil. That we have this principle, but it's not applied in broadcast, in special, because in internet this discussion, in internet, spectrum allocation for internet, this discussion even exists. It was an advance, but of course, with the new technologies and with the digitalization of information, the scarcity, the artificial scarcity is now more visible than it existed before, but now it's more visible, and then we should do the discussion inside this context. But until it doesn't happen, this is a standard that we keep in mind. But even though we talked about a portion of spectrum to private companies or to private service, to state service, and to public service, it doesn't mean that the spectrum in a way, in total, is a common resource. It is a common resource, and even if it's and if its company are providing service in there, they have to do that in a public interest way. So it's only the agents that are providing the service, or that are using the spectrum, and not the nature of the spectrum as a public and a common resource.
Okay. Final comment? We are finished. Okay. Final comment from you. Rápido.
Just a brief comment about surveillance, and I believe that this idea of free spectrum can point to some technological possibilities to escape from this surveillance. We know that one of the big problem with the surveillance in internet is that we do not have control of the material infrastructure where the data flows. When we are talking about spectrum, if you are talking encrypted communication in spectrum, the things changed. So it's a great point to develop.
Okay, thank you. I pass to Carlos Afonso to finish.
Just to thank you very much for the participation. It was excellent, and it's a pity that we don't have 3 or 4 hours more to discuss the issue. Thank you very much.